Jocelyn.
Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. I'm Jocelyn Keith-Asante, a volunteer with the Calgary Alliance for the Common Goods Truth and Reconciliation Research Action Team, and a congregant of the member organization, the Unitarian Church of Calgary, speaking in favor of the Council's recommendations to increase available affordable housing and housing in general as soon as possible. A bit of history. When some World War II veterans returned to Canada from the war, they were housed and paid to go to university, which is how intergenerational wealth was created in the white and white-passing Canadian population. Indigenous veterans were ignored, lost status, and were treated as less than human. People of the global majority of Canada were treated poorly because of racism, and still are. Just try to rent an apartment if you're an Indigenous or a person of the global majority. It can be demoralizing and has not changed. Racism is still a major factor. I benefited greatly from the federal government's housing and school support for my father and his young family. The most courageous member of Dad's platoon was not housed and schooled when he returned to Canada. As an Indigenous man, he lost status, suffered greatly, and died of exposure in a parking lot in Prince George in the 1980s, 30 years before my father died. A few notes from a couple of articles I was looking at. Before the 1990s, the federal government played a major role in the provision of affordable housing in Canada, partnering with provincial and housing agencies to build tens of thousands of units of affordable housing annually across the country. Today, there are over 600,000 units of social housing across Canada, the majority being built between World War II and 1990s. The federal government support was reduced to almost zero by consecutive Conservative and Liberal governments by 1996, precipitated by the recession of the 1980s and 90s. But the expenditures cleared from the government's balance sheet soon appeared at the local and provincial level in the form of exploding health and social service costs. When the homelessness crisis appeared in the late 1990s, leading Canada's researchers in Canada correlate the beginning of the homelessness crisis in Canada to the massive federal government cuts to affordable housing provision in the 1990s and the welfare cutback that followed. Since 1996, the ineffective re-entry of the federal government by either Liberals or Conservatives into social housing since the 1990s has led to the housing crisis in Calgary today. Until the federal government once again becomes a major partner in social housing across Canada, the City of Calgary must do what it can to improve this dire situation. Much immigration to Canada occurred between World War II and the 1990s. These immigrants benefited from the federal government's strong presence in social housing. If your family immigrated to Calgary during this time, you had an advantage over those who have arrived here since then, when federal government supported social housing ended and more people were arriving to the same limited supply of social housing. However, some say that when their predecessors came to Canada, they were solely responsible for their successes. Don't forget that Canada supported immigration with available affordable housing, which is a requirement when starting out in a new country, learning a new language and customs. Of course, hard work and perseverance is also required, but we forget how many supports were already in place. All council needs to vote for these recommendations and stop protecting their NIMBY constituents and densify our neighborhoods with affordable housing now. We want Indigenous and other equity-deserving peoples to succeed when they live in Calgary. We want immigrants to succeed when they build a life in Calgary. We also want our children to succeed when they start their new lives here. The City of Calgary must now be creative and forward-looking to make more affordable housing. Stop protecting the wealthy. Make all neighborhoods inclusive and denser. The 50s and 60s are over. There is a housing crisis in Calgary now. We need to look at our history to see how we got here and do what we can now to turn the tide of looming homelessness and increasing poverty by recreating the dynamic team of federal, provincial, and municipal governments working together as they did for 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Asma.